And welcome back, everyone. Welcome back to Morning Musings here on Now TV. Yeah, I'm wearing the same shirt because I'm filming two videos at the same time. Just convenience sake, okay? Because my schedule is absolutely totally crazy, so I need to get a film or two ahead. So that's why I'm wearing the same shirt that I did for the previous video. Now, listen, let me implore you. If you did not really catch the power of the previous video, let me encourage you to take that video and listen to it carefully over and over and over again if necessary. Because you see, ladies and gentlemen, the question of whether or not, when we read Revelation chapter 1, 1 to 3, the question of whether we take those time statements literally, objectively, determines in great part how we are going to interpret the entire book of Revelation. Because you see, if the entirety of the book of Revelation really was to be fulfilled shortly, quickly, soon, then there's simply no way for us to say it hasn't been fulfilled yet, 2,000 years later. And let's be really candid. At hand, quickly, shortly, and soon does not mean 2,000 years. And for those people who try to mitigate, to negate, to otherwise ignore all of the time statements in the book of Revelation, not to mention the New Testament as a whole, this is a foundationally important, critical issue. Because you see, if you cannot mitigate an entire vocabulary, an entire vocabulary of time words that are used in the New Testament as well as in the book of Revelation, then your future schema falls to the ground or it goes up in smoke. So let me reiterate, if in fact the time statements of the book of Revelation are to be taken objectively, if they are to be understood literally of events that were to take place very, very soon, in John's generation, as a matter of fact, as we shall see as we proceed along, if you cannot negate that fact, it means that the entirety of the book of Revelation is fulfilled. And it's interesting to me that about a week ago, I was listening to a blog by my friend Gary DeMar. I appreciate Gary so very, very much. He and I have corresponded a good bit. We've talked a good bit. I consider him a really fine scholar and a really fine guy, okay? So he was talking about Revelation, talking about Revelation chapter 20. And my friend made some comments that I find just incredible. And among other things that he said, and by the way, his blog, it's found on his website. Just look up Gary DeMar blog, what have you. But Gary DeMar said, down toward the end of his blog, he said, I am becoming more and more convinced that the entirety of the book of Revelation, every bit of it, is fulfilled. What? Now, my question would be to my good friend, how can you say that the entirety of the book of Revelation is fulfilled and still be a futurist in any way, shape, form, or fashion? Fulfilled means fulfilled. It doesn't mean waiting to be fulfilled. And thus to say, all, not some of it, not even most of it, but to say that all of the book of Revelation stands fulfilled today is logically to be a full preterist. Now, I made a comment in the previous program that if we are to take the time statements of the book of Revelation literally, prosaically, in their natural, normal definition of temporal imminence, then futurism goes up in flames. Because once again, I know this is a bit repetitious, but that's okay. We have to catch the power of this. If the entirety of the book of Revelation was to be fulfilled quickly, shortly, soon, and it was at hand, then there is no way to have a futurist eschatology. Because the book of Revelation does not say some of this is at hand, but some of it's a long time off. No, 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 no. The book says, and here's what's fascinating about it, in Revelation chapter 22, after describing the millennium and the end of the millennium judgment, the arrival of the new heaven and new earth, Revelation chapter 22 and verse 6 tells us the God of the prophets has sent and signified these things must shortly come to pass. What things? Well, the antecedent things, which is the end of the millennium, the judgment, the resurrection, the wedding, the new heaven and the new earth. These things must shortly come to pass. So once again, ladies and gentlemen, if we are going, unless you can destroy, literally destroy, the temporal imminence of all of the time statements of the New Testament, and particularly of the book of Revelation, then any futurist eschatology goes up in smoke. Smoke and flame. Now, some attempt to say, well, you know, at hand quickly and shortly, that yes, they all mean temporal imminence because the end is always near. The end is always at hand. Well, let me say this as kindly as possible, ladies and gentlemen, that's just utter nonsense. As I said on the last program, this is the kind of stuff that doesn't even make good nonsense. Either something, an event, and that's what the parousia, the judgment, the resurrection. That event cannot always be at hand, and yet far off at the same time. This is double talk. And yet, you know, here in the year 2022, we don't have a specific date set yet. We're working on that. As I make this video, I am due to have a formal YouTube debate with a gentleman by the name of Anthony Aquino. And he attempts to argue, well, I don't deny the time statements at all. I agree that when the New Testament writer said the parousia is at hand, it was at hand and it's still at hand today. When the New Testament writer said these things must shortly come to pass, I agree with that. They will come to pass rapidly. Doesn't mean they'll come soon from our perspective, but when they finally get to, when they finally take place, they will occur rapidly. Well, once again, ladies and gentlemen, it's nonsense. We've already examined the Greek term entokai. Entokai does not mean rapidity of action as opposed to imminence of occurrence. It just doesn't mean that. And you literally have to pervert it to make it mean that. Do we really want to do that? Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry. There is no rhyme, there's no reason, there's no logic, there's no proper exegesis in that kind of actions toward the time words of the New Testament. Now, in the previous program, I shared with you an incredibly important passage. Luke chapter 21 and verse 8. Now, remember, the apostles had asked, in response to Jesus' prediction of the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple, they asked, tell us, when shall these things be? What shall be the sign of your parousia and the end of the age? I shared with you how writing later in that very generation, James had some remarkable things to say. But first of all, let's go back now to Luke 21 and verse 8. In answering the apostles' questions about the sign of his parousia and the end of the age, Jesus said, many will come in my name saying, I am he, and the end has drawn near. Now, the word end there in the Greek is literally the word kairos. We're going to have a lot to say about that when we come to Revelation chapter 1 and verse 3. But as a kind of a heads up, kairos means the divinely appointed time. It is an incredibly important word in the New Testament. So here in Luke chapter 21, the premature and false prophets were going to say the appointed time for the parousia and the end of the age has drawn near. Jesus said, don't believe them. But remember, as I pointed out in the previous program, Jesus told his apostles, who told the early church, he gave them a number of signs to indicate the imminence of the coming of the Lord. One of them being, this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world as a witness to the nations. Then comes the end. Okay. What shall be the sign of the end of the age? This gospel shall be preached in all the world as a witness to the nations. Then comes the end. Was the gospel preached into all the world in that generation? Now, most denominational people say, oh, no. It hasn't been done yet. But you see, that's imposing a modern day cosmology on the first century. This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world. Well, the Greek word world there is oikumene. And by the way, in my book, Into All the World, Then Comes the End, I go through this extensively, doing the linguistic study and answering the question, was the gospel preached into all the world in the first century? Well, the Greek word oikumene means the inhabited world. And when we, living 2,000 years beyond the first century and the first century definition of the word, say, oh, well, the gospel wasn't preached in South America, Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia. It wasn't preached there in the first century, was it? Was it preached in North America, was it? And no, it wasn't. So, Jesus wasn't talking about the gospel being preached in the globe in the first century. He was talking about the gospel being preached into the unknown inhabited world in the first century. And Paul, in Colossians chapter 1 and verse 5 and through verse 7, Paul said, we are bound to give thanks always to you for the grace of God, for the love which you have for all of the saints, and for the love of the gospel, which you first obeyed, the gospel which is bringing forth fruit in you as it is also in all of the world. Greek word here, cosmos. And then in verse 23, he says the gospel had been preached to every creature under heaven. You know, Jesus said, go preach the gospel to every creature. Mark 16, 15 to 16. Paul said the gospel has been preached to every creature. Now, was Paul lying? Was Paul deluded? Was Paul changing the definition of world? And again, in my book, Into All the World, Then Comes the End, it's available from my websites, donkpreston.com, bibleprophecy.com, or eschatology.org, which has lately been beautifully redesigned and revamped. So be sure to go there and visit. But go there and order my book, Into All the World, Then Comes the End. And if you do, I'll include a free copy of Can God Tell Time? Okay? U.S. orders only. I can't make the offer to those out of the U.S. Okay, now then. So, pardon me, had to give that little bit of a side excursus because the apostles asked, tell us about a sign of the end of the age and your parousia. Jesus said, well, here's one of them. The gospel shall be preached into all of the world as a witness to the nations, Greek word ethnoi. Paul said the gospel had been preached to all the nations in the world, Romans chapter 10, verse 18 and following. So show us a sign, or tell us about a sign of your coming, the end of the age, the preaching of the gospel into all the world, which was accomplished. And when he warned the apostles about false teachers who were going to come saying, the appointed time has drawn near, Jesus nonetheless told those apostles, those living, breathing apostles, when you see, not when a later generation sees, not when people 2,000 years away, not when they see, but when you see these things come to pass, know that it, end of the age, parousia, is nigh, ingus, or taku, I believe. Excuse me, had a little bit of a brain burp there. It's ingus. Know that it, parousia, end of the age, has drawn near, even at the doors. As a reminder now, James, who was not there on the mountain but knew the warnings, James writing 25 years later, after the gospel had been preached into the world, James said, the parousia, which is what the apostles asked about, which is what the false teachers would prematurely say had drawn near. James wrote and said, the parousia has drawn near, and he also said the judge is, not will be one day, is standing right at the door. He all but quotes Matthew 24, verse 32. How much more perfect could our correlations and connections and connecting the dots be? This is powerful stuff, ladies and gentlemen. But, in my estimation, it gets even better. Now remember, Jesus said, or John wrote, the Father sent Jesus to tell the churches, these things must shortly come to pass. Was the Father telling the truth? I mean, after all, he knew the day and the hour. And he told Jesus to tell the churches, these things must shortly come to pass. And I'm getting ahead of myself, but notice Revelation 1, verse 3. Blessed who reads and who keeps the sayings of this book, for the time is at hand. Literally has drawn near. Wait a minute. Folks, this is the Father who knew the day and the hour, telling Jesus to tell John, to tell the churches the time, the appointed time has drawn near. But what did Jesus warn the apostles about in Luke 21 verse 8? Well, he warned them about false teachers who were going to come prematurely, and they were going to prematurely say, the appointed time has drawn near. Yet, here's the Father. Do you catch the power of this? Here is the Father telling Jesus, tell the churches, the appointed time has drawn near. I think, personally, I think we're on really, really safe grounds to say the Father knew what he was talking about. Now remember, the false teachers didn't. The false teachers were making premature declarations of the nearness of end. Now, listen, you just absolutely got to catch this. So, John MacArthur, noted evangelical scholar of the day, acknowledges that the New Testament, it sounds like Jesus taught his apostles that his coming was to be in that generation. But of course, we all know that Jesus didn't come in that generation. So did Jesus fail, as John MacArthur notes that the skeptics claim? And John MacArthur, bless his heart, says, no, Jesus didn't fail. How then do we explain all of these time statements? And John MacArthur says, it's certainly true that many people have become discouraged because Jesus did not come in that generation, even though it seems that he predicted that he would. And we all know that the skeptics use Jesus' statements to make it appear as if he failed. Well, yeah, it does appear that he made those statements. So how does John MacArthur try to deal with this conundrum, this paradox? Well, John MacArthur says the reason that Jesus used the language that he did, that sounded like the coming of the Lord and the judgment and the resurrection, was so imminent and was to occur in that generation, is because God wants every generation to be constantly on the tiptoe of expectation that the coming of the Lord is to be in their generation. No, that's not what Jesus taught. I'm sorry, Mr. MacArthur, that's a perversion of what Jesus said. You see, if God wanted every single generation to be standing on the tiptoe of expectation about the coming of the Lord, to be in their generation, Jesus could not have condemned the teachers who were about to come, who would say the time is drawn near, because they were simply urging people to be on the tiptoe of expectation. And John MacArthur says there's no problem with that. That's what Jesus wanted. No, it's not what Jesus wanted. Jesus did not want his apostles or his disciples, his followers, to be living as if they believed that the coming of the Lord was so imminent, as some did in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, that they actually stopped working. And so Paul had to write to them and say to them, get back to work. If a man won't work, neither should he eat. But you see, in John MacArthur's view, we're supposed to believe that the coming of the Lord is so imminent, going to occur in our generation. We're supposed to believe that so fervently, so zealously, that we're on the tiptoe of expectation every single day of our life. But ladies and gentlemen, the proverb writer expressed it well. You know this is a fact from human experience. Hope deferred makes the heart sick. So consider this. If every single generation is supposed to be standing on the tiptoe of expectation, believing and thinking, hoping that the second coming judgment resurrection is to occur at any single moment, then the teachers in Luke chapter 21 and verse 8 were doing the church a favor by saying, the time is fulfilled. The time is drawn near. I mean, after all they were doing is causing the church to be standing on the tiptoe of expectation, according to John MacArthur. So what would be wrong with that? Because you see, John MacArthur would jump ahead to James chapter 5 and say, see, James, the inspired writer, says, the coming of the Lord, the parousia, has drawn near. The judge is standing right at the door. And James was only expressing those terms in words of eminence so as to keep the church on the tiptoe of expectation. Then James falls into the identical category of those in Luke chapter 21 and verse 8 that Jesus said, don't believe them. So Jesus said, there's some people going to come saying the time is fulfilled. The end has drawn near. And the apostles living in the first century were not to believe them and to label them as false teachers, because that's what they were. But those same apostles and Jesus' disciples living later in that very generation said, the end has drawn near. The kairos, the appointed time, has drawn near, and the judge is standing right at the door. And John MacArthur says, great job, James. You're keeping the church on the tiptoe of expectation. So on the one hand, here's one group of people that Jesus condemned for putting people on the tiptoe of expectation. Here is James writing in the same identical generation, saying the same identical thing virtually. And that's okay for him to say, the parousia has drawn near. The judge is standing right at the door. Folks, what's the difference here? You know there's no difference. Only one was condemned by Jesus himself for making premature declarations of the nearness of the end, and yet we're supposed to believe James when he said the parousia and the judgment had drawn near 2,000 years ago. Do you see how this impacts our understanding of Revelation? If you don't yet, we have more to come. So I'll see you next week.